Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to repeat his commitment to doing Rafah. And the US is not saying you can't do it under any circumstances. They seem to be saying, here's how we would like you to do it more clinically, how they would have any faith at this stage, 6 months next week, that is what will eventually play out. Has the mind boggled? Now, by the way, Rafah is not happening at the moment because Israel does not have the troop availability. Israel is not prepared militarily yet to do that. It needs some weeks to be able to cycle back reservists and redeploy others of its military. By the way, part of that might be a question of how much of the Israeli military is deployed in the north, on the Lebanon border, where we have seen further signs of an escalation.
Right. What will Israel, the Israeli ambassador, be saying this afternoon to the British Foreign Secretary? What would Israel be saying to America, whose concern and displeasure is very clear?
I will leave that to the Israeli ambassador, who has a track record of being quite open and transparent about Israel's opposition to peace in the past, to make their statements. What we have heard from the Israeli side is what we normally hear. This is Hamas's fault. They hide in these convoys. Perhaps this was an error. It will be investigated. The investigations never go anywhere. It's taken this bombing, British workers gone out there to try and get some alleviation to the people of Gaza, to get this kind of attention. The person behind this entire initiative is an extremely well-known kind of Washington culinary celebrity, Jose Andreas. But what we've seen continuously is journalists killed, UN workers killed, and Palestinian civilians killed. There's not been much of an ask or demand on Israel to investigate those killings. But better late than never. At least attention is now on how Israel is conducting its targeting. And I'll just give you the headline right now in the Israeli Haaretz media, that the convoy was bombed 3 times, targeting a Hamas member who wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to an Israeli government spokesman earlier who cited that report in Haaretz, and his answer was that Haaretz is a left-wing news organ, and suggested that made it less credible. But it is also surely plainly apparent to the Israeli leadership now that the patience of its important allies, the United States, and also the United Kingdom, is running out, and that must have implications for their conduct of the conflict.
I'd like to think so, but I think it's only fair to push that question back and ask, is that patience of the US, of the UK, of the Allies really running out? Because we saw the reports, John, in the weekend media here in the UK, that the legal section in our government has made a designation that Israel is in violation of international law, and that is incumbent on the UK government, according to its own procedures, to cease arms exports to Israel. But the government is slow walking that. We haven't seen the Prime Minister make that decision. We haven't seen that stop. And perhaps more to the point, because this is where the endless flow of weapons is really coming from the US, much less so from the UK. We saw the reports again just in the last days in the Washington Post and elsewhere that there have been yet more of this conveyor belt, not just of any weapons, but of these extremely heavy ordnance bombs, which have caused so much destruction. On another incident earlier in this war, they went after one Hamas guy. Apparently, they killed 100 civilians. It's ordnance that Western states do not use anymore because of its destructive capacity in urban built-up areas. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that the Israeli Prime Minister is not feeling the kind of heat that will lead Israel to really revisit what it is doing here, given the level of death and destruction against innocent civilians. Remember, it was on day 1 of this war that the Israelis announced that they would prevent food, fuel, water, electricity getting to the civilian population. That's why there's a humanitarian catastrophe. That's why we need this aid in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably right to point out, isn't it, Daniel, it is not established that government lawyers have advised ministers and other officials in the British government that Israel is in breach of international law. I mean, there's speculation on that, and there have been demands from some, including the opposition in Westminster, to see that legal advice. But so far, it has not been forthcoming, and you imagine it's not likely to be. I mean, do you believe Rafah, the invasion of Rafah, is then still a live option, despite the public warnings from people like America?
I very much do, John, because Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to repeat his commitment to doing Rafah. And the US is not saying you can't do it under any circumstances. They seem to be saying, here's how we would like you to do it more clinically, how they would have any faith at this stage, 6 months next week, that is what will eventually play out. Has the mind boggled? Now, by the way, Rafah is not happening at the moment because Israel does not have the troop availability. Israel is not prepared militarily yet to do that. It needs some weeks to be able to cycle back reservists and redeploy others of its military. By the way, part of that might be a question of how much of the Israeli military is deployed in the north, on the Lebanon border, where we have seen further signs of an escalation. Right. So this is, of course, about Gaza, but also now I think we are closer than ever to a broader regional conflagration, although that's not yet given.
Right. Now, just the last word on internal pressure. As one who knows Israel well, we hear there's a good deal of dissent in Israel about the rule of Benjamin Netanyahu. You don't hear there's a huge amount of pressure, unless I'm wrong, you don't hear there's a huge amount of pressure from Israel to change its tactics and strategy in Gaza. Israeli people are clearly significantly worried about the plight of the hostages in Gaza, but not about the death toll among Palestinians. Is that an accurate reading?
It is, John, and it's a really important point you raise, but there is a connection. In other words, yes, there's not, amongst the Zionist mainstream of the Jewish community, there's not a pushback on what's going on, but there's a real fault line there, as you suggest, on what priority should be accorded to hostages coming first or continuing with the war effort. And the protests in the last days have been unprecedented inside Israel to prioritize getting a deal, getting the hostages out. And that's what one would like to see the US working with Qatar and Egypt to put a package on the table which pulls together getting the hostages out and getting a ceasefire. We haven't seen that yet. If that was put on the table, then I think there'd be real pressure on Netanyahu, especially if there were threats regarding the weapons. Then his war cabinet would have a dilemma, his military would have a dilemma, and I think you'd see greater public mobilization.
Right. Just a last question, and we can only speculate about this, but if and when there is a hostage deal, and if that happens, it becomes clear that many of the hostages are in fact dead. Do you anticipate that would have the impact of hardening Israeli opinion, making it more militant?
Look, that there are even reports in the Israeli press increasingly as to that reality, that this is not going to be the numbers that are often talked about who are still being held. I think if there's going to be a chance of getting a significant cohort of hostages out alive, time is running out. Time's, of course, running out for the civilian population in Gaza. The way I think this might play out, John, is the first phase would probably involve most of those still alive. And then it would not become clear, and I don't think Hamas will clarify this, how many after that are still alive. And so the goal would be, in that first phase, to try and maximize the implausibility of a continuation of what we've seen in the last 6 months. And I think that's possible to do. I think at some stage, Israel is going to wake up from this nightmare of October 7th and post-October 7th and question whether this was the right way to achieve Israeli security. I don't think it's gone well on the battlefield. And yes, hearts are hardened. But at some stage, especially if Israel is held to account, I think people are going to say, is this working out for us? Is there a different approach? I hope that's what we see eventually.
These are all pretty dark thoughts. But Daniel Levy, thank you for coming on the program.